The fall did not begin in a courtroom, and it did not begin inside a jail. It began hours earlier, beneath soft lights and loud music, where laughter spilled into the night and champagne glasses clinked like a promise that nothing could go wrong. For a brief moment, Nick Reiner looked like someone who had outrun his past. Faces turned toward him, cameras flashed, and the noise of Hollywood wrapped around him like a familiar shield. To anyone watching from the outside, it could have seemed like a return, a fragile rebirth after years of chaos, addiction, and drifting. But beneath that polished surface, something was already unraveling. When the night ended and the music faded, there was no warning of what was coming next. No dramatic pause, just the sudden, brutal snap of reality closing in. By morning, the lights were gone, replaced by concrete walls, steel doors, and a silence that pressed in on him from every direction. The contrast was violent in its speed, as if two different lives had collided and only one could survive. Inside the Twin Towers jail in Los Angeles, time did not move the way it does outside. It thickened. Each minute stretched longer than the last, heavy with isolation and dread. Nick found himself alone in a cell, stripped of comfort, stripped of identity, stripped even of the small rituals that remind a person they still belong to the world. The air was stale, the walls damp and stained, and the light above him burned without mercy, never dimming, never allowing true night to fall. Solitary confinement became his entire universe, a place where the mind has nowhere to escape except inward, where thoughts echo until they begin to feel louder than screams. Reports described filth, mold, foul water, and food barely fit to be called a meal, but the physical decay was only part of the punishment. Long before any verdict, the environment itself felt like a sentence, grinding down the spirit with quiet efficiency. Nick maintained his innocence, yet every sunrise arrived with the same question hanging over him, unanswered and suffocating. Was this justice, or was it something colder, something designed to break before judged? The weight of what he was facing pressed down relentlessly. 2 counts of first-degree homicide, charges so severe they carried the possibility of life without parole or a death sentence under California law, even with executions officially paused. The threat alone was enough to hollow a person out from the inside. When he was finally brought into court days later, the room fell silent. His appearance said what words could not. Pale skin stretched tight over a thinning frame, eyes dulled by exhaustion and fear. Movements slowed as if gravity itself had grown heavier around him. He wore a thick blue safety garment meant to prevent self-harm, stiff and awkward, clinging to him like a reminder that he was no longer trusted even with his own body. There was no normal clothing beneath it, no small dignity left intact. Every step was watched, every breath measured. 3 attorneys sat close, forming a barrier against cameras and onlookers, but they could not hide the trembling of his hands or the vacant stillness in his expression. When the judge spoke, Nick's responses were barely audible, his voice thin and hoarse, as though each word cost him more than he had left to give. "Yes, Your Honor." The phrase repeated, fragile and mechanical, echoing through the room like the last thread holding him upright. The hearing ended quickly, but the image lingered. Guards escorted him out, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight, his walk slow and uneven. No family stood behind him. No friends waited nearby. When the doors closed and he was led back toward the jail, it felt less like a transfer and more like a descent. The Twin Towers facility loomed not just as a building, but as a symbol, a place long described as unforgiving, notorious for housing the most vulnerable and the most unstable minds. For Nick Reiner, this was no longer a story about fame, privilege, or scandal. It was the beginning of a long, silent confrontation with isolation, fear, and the crushing realization that the world he once knew had vanished overnight. In that narrow cell, with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of his own thoughts, the question was no longer how he got there, but how much of himself would survive what came next. Long before the headlines, Long before the courtroom sketches and the prison walls, Nick Reiner grew up in a world shaped by contrast. On one side, there was comfort, access, and opportunity. On the other, an unspoken pressure that never fully lifted. Being born into a well-known family did not mean safety from inner chaos. It meant growing up under a quiet expectation to be okay, to succeed, to fit into a narrative already written by others. From an early age, Nick was surrounded by creativity, conversations about film, politics, and culture, dinner tables filled with influential voices. Yet even in those rooms, there were moments when he felt strangely distant, as if he were watching life through glass instead of standing inside it. People who knew him described a sensitive child, intelligent and curious, but prone to retreating inward when overwhelmed. He was not reckless by nature. He was searching, restless, trying to understand why his thoughts felt heavier than those of others. As adolescence gave way to adulthood, that internal tension began to surface more visibly. Nick struggled to find balance, drifting between periods of apparent stability and stretches of confusion and emotional volatility. The weight of expectation followed him everywhere. Success seemed assumed, failure quietly feared. When he spoke about feeling lost or unwell, the responses around him were often well-intentioned but distant, filtered through professional language and clinical solutions. Doctors, therapists, rehabilitation programs came and went. Each carried credentials, confidence, and structured plans. His parents listened, hoping expertise would succeed where instinct felt uncertain. Yet Nick himself often said the treatments did not work the way they were supposed to. He felt unheard, misunderstood, labeled rather than known. Over time, the sense that something was wrong deepened. His mental health struggles intensified, and with them came addiction, a desperate attempt to quiet a mind that refused to rest. Substance use did not arrive as rebellion, but as relief, brief moments where the noise softened and the fear loosened its grip. Those moments never lasted. What followed were cycles of recovery and relapse, promises and disappointment, hope and exhaustion. Friends and family watched him fade in and out of focus, present one day and unreachable the next. There were stretches when he disappeared entirely, sleeping on couches, drifting through streets, cutting ties with the very world that once defined him. The contrast was stark. One week he was surrounded by resources most people could only imagine. The next he was struggling to meet basic needs, ashamed to ask for help yet desperate for understanding. Through it all, his parents remained caught in an impossible position. They wanted to protect their son, to keep him alive, to trust systems designed to help. At the same time, they carried the quiet guilt of wondering if listening to experts meant ignoring the person who mattered most. Nick's illness did not announce itself neatly. It did not follow a straight line. There were moments when he seemed sharp, articulate, self-aware, and deeply reflective. He spoke about wanting a normal life, about feeling like a burden, about fearing he would never escape the shadow of his own mind. Other times, paranoia crept in, reality bending at the edges, trust dissolving into suspicion. He underwent psychiatric treatment, and at times was diagnosed with serious conditions that explained some of his behavior, but did not fully capture his experience. To those around him, he was not a case file. He was a son, a friend, a human being slipping further away despite every effort to pull him back. The years leading up to the tragedy were marked by instability rather than violence. There were no clear signs that pointed inevitably to what would come. Instead, there was a slow accumulation of stress, untreated pain, and moments where help arrived too late or in the wrong form. Nick oscillated between wanting independence and needing care, between rejecting intervention and begging to be understood. He lived with the constant sense that he was failing at something everyone else seemed to manage effortlessly. Even during brief periods of sobriety and apparent calm, there was an undercurrent of fear. He worried about disappointing his parents, about being judged by the public, about losing control of his thoughts entirely. Those close to him noticed how often he apologized, even for things that were not his fault. There was a fragility beneath his interactions, a sense that he was bracing himself against an unseen collapse. When the night of the alleged crime finally arrived, it did not emerge from nowhere. It came at the end of years of internal struggle, fractured communication, and a system that could not fully reconcile mental illness with personal responsibility. The world would later reduce his past to headlines and diagnoses, but the truth was messier, quieter, and more human. Nick Reiner's story before the arrest was not one of cruelty or intent, but of a man slowly losing his footing while everyone around him searched for the right way to help. By the time the sirens replaced the silence, the distance between who he was and who he had become felt impossible to bridge. The night everything shattered did not arrive with chaos at first. It came quietly, almost deceptively ordinary, as if the world were holding its breath. In the hours leading up to the tragedy, nothing outward signaled that a line was about to be crossed that could never be erased. Inside the house, familiar walls stood still, carrying years of memories, arguments, reconciliations, and unspoken fears. This was not a place associated with violence, but with concern, exhaustion, and the constant tension of loving someone whose mind seemed to be slipping further out of reach. For Nick, that tension had become unbearable. His thoughts no longer moved in straight lines. They collided, overlapped, and spiraled, pulling fragments of fear and guilt into something that felt overwhelming and inescapable. People who have lived with severe mental illness often describe a moment when reality fractures, when logic dissolves and instinct takes over. For Nick, that moment appears to have arrived without warning, compressing years of confusion into a single, irreversible collapse. What happened next would later be dissected in courtrooms and media reports, but in that moment, it unfolded in isolation, unseen by the world that would soon judge it. When authorities arrived, the scene they encountered stood in brutal contrast to the family's public image. 2 lives were gone, and Nick was found at the center of a tragedy that defied easy explanation. Shock moved quickly through the media, not just because of the violence, but because of who was involved. The narrative shifted instantly from concern to horror, from private struggle to public spectacle. Headlines formed before questions could be asked, before mental health evaluations, before any clear understanding of Nick's state of mind. In the aftermath, he appeared disoriented, emotionally vacant, as if the weight of what had occurred had not yet reached him in full. That numbness did not last. Once in custody, reality began to close in with suffocating force. The arrest marked the abrupt end of ambiguity and the beginning of absolute control by the system. From that moment forward, Nick's movements, speech, and even silence were scrutinized. The early hours of detention are often disorienting for anyone, but for someone already struggling with perception and paranoia, they can feel like psychological free fall. He was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, and reduced to a case number, each step stripping away another layer of identity. Questions came rapidly, some clinical, some procedural, each one carrying implications he may not have fully grasped. When asked about his mental state, about thoughts of self-harm or harm to others, his answers placed him into a category that would define his confinement going forward. Somewhere between intake and evaluation, officials determined that Nick was unstable, a risk not only to others but to himself. That judgment altered everything. Instead of being housed in a standard holding area, he was placed in a high-observation housing, a section reserved for those deemed mentally fragile or unpredictable. This was not explained to him in detail. There was no conversation, no reassurance, only a quiet redirection deeper into the building. His cell was small and bare, surrounded by thick concrete that absorbed sound and light. A steel door sealed him inside, with only a narrow slot at the bottom for food and a small window for constant monitoring. The light overhead never turned off. Time lost its meaning almost immediately. Day and night blurred into a continuous stretch of wakefulness and exhaustion. He was forced to wear a heavy blue safety garment designed to prevent self-harm, coarse against his skin and impossible to ignore. No shoes, no personal items, no sense of privacy remained. Even basic human routines were controlled. Meals arrived without utensils. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted every 15 minutes by guards peering in and documenting his position. The sounds around him became relentless. Screams echoed through the corridors, fists banged against walls. Voices whispered to people who were not there. Those noises crept into his cell, merging with his own racing thoughts until it became impossible to tell where fear ended and imagination began. In that environment, Nick's mental state deteriorated rapidly. Isolation did not calm him. It magnified everything he was already struggling to contain. He paced for hours, then collapsed onto the thin mat on the floor, overwhelmed by waves of panic and despair. At times he whispered to himself, repeating the same phrases again and again, as if trying to anchor his mind to something solid. "I am innocent. I did not do this." The words looped endlessly, offering no relief. Interrogations added another layer of pressure. When he was brought into questioning rooms, the setting was stark and impersonal. Bright lights, bare walls, cameras quietly recording every movement. Questions were repeated, rephrased, pressed harder each time. His reactions were analyzed, his silences interpreted, his confusion taken as resistance. For someone already teetering on the edge, the process felt less like investigation and more like psychological siege. He began to shake uncontrollably. His breathing grew shallow. At moments, he seemed to retreat entirely, staring at the floor, unable to respond. Each attempt to assert his innocence appeared to increase suspicion rather than resolve it. Back in his cell, the emotional toll became visible. Guards observed him crying for long stretches, his body rocking as sobs tore through him without restraint. He spoke aloud to his parents, apologizing repeatedly, not for the crime itself, but for years of pain, disappointment, and fear. His words blurred into raw expressions of regret and longing, the language of someone unraveling under unbearable weight. At night, when the noise subsided, the silence felt even more threatening. The hum of ventilation systems and fluorescent lights filled the void, a constant reminder that he was being watched even when alone. Sleep deprivation compounded his distress, eroding his ability to think clearly or regulate emotion. By the time days turned into weeks, the person who had entered custody scarcely resembled the man who had walked out of that party hours before his arrest. The glamorous world he had briefly touched felt unreal, distant, almost imagined. What remained was a man suspended between accusation and evaluation, guilt and illness, waiting for a legal process that moved far slower than his mental collapse. The tragedy was no longer confined to the crime itself. It was unfolding continuously, minute by minute, inside a cell where fear, confusion, and isolation fed on each other without mercy. The impact of what happened did not stop at the jail doors. It spread outward in slow, heavy waves, touching everyone connected to Nick's life and reshaping how his story was seen and understood. Inside the walls of the facility, the consequences were immediate and deeply personal. His mental health continued to decline under the strain of constant surveillance and isolation. Each day became a test of endurance rather than a step toward clarity. The environment offered no space for healing, only containment. The lack of privacy, the relentless monitoring, and the absence of familiar human contact eroded what little sense of stability he had left. Moments of calm were rare and fleeting, quickly swallowed by anxiety and intrusive thoughts. Over time, the exhaustion settled into his bones, making even simple actions feel monumental. Outside, the consequences took a different shape. News of the charges spread rapidly, transforming a private family tragedy into a public spectacle. Media coverage shifted focus from concern to judgment, often flattening a complex history of mental illness into a single narrative of violence. For many observers, nuance disappeared. The story became easier to digest when framed in absolutes: guilt or innocence, monster or victim. Lost in that framing were the years of struggle, the unanswered questions, and the uncomfortable reality that mental illness does not fit neatly into legal categories. Friends and acquaintances found themselves unsure how to speak about Nick, torn between sympathy and disbelief. Silence replaced conversation, not out of indifference, but fear of saying the wrong thing. His parents' deaths sent shockwaves through the community, leaving grief layered with confusion and anger. People mourned not only the lives lost, but the sense of safety that vanished with them. For those who knew the family, the tragedy forced a painful reckoning with how invisible suffering can become, even in households filled with resources and care. The legal process moved forward with deliberate slowness, a stark contrast to the speed of Nick's psychological unraveling. Court dates were scheduled, postponed, and rescheduled again, each delay stretching the uncertainty further. Prosecutors focused on the severity of the charges, emphasizing the need for accountability and public safety. Defense attorneys raised concerns about Nick's mental competence, arguing that his current condition made meaningful participation in his own defense impossible. Psychiatric evaluations became central, not as a path to resolution, but as another layer of waiting. During this time, Nick remained confined without bail, his days blending together in an unbroken loop of observation and isolation. The possibility of a death sentence, though unlikely to be carried out, hovered like a permanent shadow. Even the suggestion of such an outcome weighed heavily, amplifying his fear and despair. For someone already struggling to distinguish threat from reality, the knowledge that his life could be legally erased intensified his sense of hopelessness. He began to internalize the idea that no outcome would bring relief, only different forms of confinement. Beyond the legal and psychological consequences, there was a broader social impact that unfolded quietly. The case reignited debates about how the justice system handles defendants with severe mental illness. Advocates pointed to conditions inside facilities like Twin Towers as evidence of systemic failure, arguing that isolation and constant surveillance worsen symptoms rather than manage them. Critics countered that public safety must come first, that compassion cannot override accountability. These arguments played out in opinion pieces and online forums, often detached from the human reality at the center of the case. Nick himself became a symbol, used to support opposing viewpoints, while his actual experience remained locked behind concrete walls. The emotional toll on extended family members was profound. Grief collided with guilt, anger with sorrow. There were no clear rituals for mourning under such circumstances, no uncomplicated memories to cling to. Every remembrance was shadowed by questions of what might have been done differently, by the haunting sense that intervention had come too late or in the wrong form. Even expressions of sympathy felt fraught, as if acknowledging loss risked minimizing the violence that had occurred. Within this emotional landscape, isolation extended beyond the jail cell, spreading into the lives of those left behind. As weeks turned into months, the long-term consequences became clearer. Nick's future narrowed to a set of grim possibilities, each defined by confinement. Whether through a life sentence, indefinite psychiatric commitment, or prolonged pretrial detention, freedom was no longer a realistic outcome. The idea of rehabilitation faded, replaced by management and containment. The system's priority was no longer understanding how he reached this point, but ensuring he remained controlled. This shift marked a quiet but significant transformation, from a person in crisis to a permanent risk to be managed. The broader message was difficult to ignore. If someone with access to wealth, legal representation, and public attention could be swallowed so completely by the system, what did that mean for those without such visibility? The case underscored how thin the line can be between care and punishment, especially when mental illness intersects with violent crime. For Nick, the consequences were not abstract or theoretical. They were lived minute by minute, in the cold light of a cell where time seemed to stand still. The tragedy had reshaped every aspect of his existence, leaving behind a life defined not by who he was, but by what he was accused of and how the system chose to respond. Away from court filings and official statements, there were quieter moments that never made headlines, fragments of Nick's experience that unfolded in silence and routine, hidden behind thick walls and locked doors. These were the moments that revealed how deeply the situation had hollowed him out, not through dramatic events, but through repetition and absence. In the high observation unit, days did not progress. They looped. Nick began to measure time not by dates, but by checks, footsteps, and the clatter of keys. Every 15 minutes, a guard would glance through the window, jot something down, and move on. The ritual never varied. Even when he slept, it continued, breaking rest into shallow fragments that left him disoriented and irritable. Over time, sleep deprivation blurred his thoughts, making memories feel unreal and fears feel immediate. Former inmates of similar units have described the same sensation, a slow erosion of the boundary between inner life and external reality. Nick was living inside that erosion. In the absence of conversation, he spoke to himself. Sometimes it was barely audible, a whisper meant only to reassure his own racing mind. Other times, his voice grew louder, as if trying to reach someone who no longer existed. He repeated phrases like apologies, explanations, fragments of conversations from years earlier. These were not confessions. They were attempts to impose order on chaos, to replay the past in hopes of finding a moment where things could have turned out differently. Guards noted these behaviors clinically, marking them as agitation or distress. But for Nick, they were lifelines, fragile threads connecting him to a sense of self that was slipping away. Contact with the outside world was minimal and tightly controlled. Legal visits took place behind glass. Words filtered through phones that felt impersonal and distant. His attorneys spoke calmly, methodically, explaining procedures and possibilities, but Nick often struggled to absorb what they said. His attention drifted, his eyes fixed on the floor or the wall behind them. When they asked how he was feeling, he answered automatically, saying he was fine, even when his hands shook uncontrollably. The effort required to appear composed left him exhausted. After each visit, he returned to his cell with a heavier sense of emptiness, reminded of how far removed he was from normal human connection. There were moments when he fixated on his parents, replaying memories with an intensity that bordered on pain. He remembered small, ordinary scenes rather than grand moments, shared meals, quiet conversations, the sound of their voices in familiar rooms. These memories surfaced without warning, overwhelming him with a mix of longing and regret. He spoke to them as if they could hear him, apologizing again and again, his words tangled in grief and confusion. To an observer, it might have looked like guilt. To Nick, it felt like mourning something he could never repair. The environment offered no comfort during these moments. The cell remained unchanged, indifferent to his emotional state. The light buzzed overhead. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and damp concrete. Even basic sensations became sources of distress. The rough fabric of a safety garment irritated his skin, a constant physical reminder of his loss of autonomy. He could not adjust the temperature, could not dim the light, could not choose when to eat or sleep. Every decision had been outsourced to the system, leaving him feeling reduced to an object rather than a person. Occasionally, he heard other inmates being moved through the corridors. Their voices echoed briefly, then vanished. Those fleeting sounds reminded him that others existed, suffering in their own isolated worlds, but also underscored how unreachable they were. There was no shared space, no casual interaction, no chance to exchange a word of reassurance. Isolation was complete, designed to minimize risk, but indifferent to the psychological cost. Over time, Nick's emotional responses grew muted. The intense sobbing of earlier days gave way to long stretches of stillness. He sat on the thin mat, staring at nothing, his body slack with exhaustion. This numbness worried those tasked with observing him, but it also made him easier to manage. A quiet inmate drew less attention than a distressed one. In this way, the system rewarded emotional withdrawal, reinforcing a state where survival meant shrinking inward. Yet even in those silent hours, his mind did not rest. Thoughts circled endlessly, replaying the same questions with no answers. What went wrong? When did he lose control? Could any of it have been prevented? Without external reference points, these questions grew heavier, pressing down until they felt unbearable. There was no resolution, only repetition. This was the unseen weight of confinement, not just the loss of freedom, but the absence of forward motion. Life reduced to endurance, measured in hours survived rather than days lived. These quiet stories, the whispered apologies, the sleepless nights, the gradual fading of expression, formed a parallel narrative to the legal case unfolding outside. They revealed a man not plotting or resisting, but unraveling slowly, piece by piece, under conditions that offered control instead of care. In these moments, stripped of spectacle and judgment, Nick Reiner existed not as a headline or a symbol, but as a person trapped inside a system that had no language for his pain, only procedures to contain it. As time stretched on, the meaning of Nick Reiner's story began to shift from a single devastating act to something broader and more unsettling. What remained was not just the question of guilt or innocence, but the legacy of a life shaped by contradiction. Privilege existed alongside fragility. Access to care coexisted with profound misunderstanding. From the outside, his life once appeared protected by wealth, family influence, and opportunity. From the inside, it was marked by a constant struggle to maintain control over thoughts that refused to settle. In that tension, the seeds of tragedy took root, not as destiny, but as an accumulation of moments where clarity slipped away and fear took its place. The system that now defined his existence was built to categorize and contain, not to reflect. Courtrooms speak the language of statutes and precedent. Jails speak the language of compliance and observation. Neither is designed to engage deeply with the slow, invisible deterioration of the human mind. As Nick's case moved forward, it highlighted a painful truth about how society treats mental illness once it intersects with violence. Compassion narrows. Patience fades. The focus shifts to risk management and liability, leaving little room for understanding the person behind the diagnosis. In this framework, mental illness becomes either a defense to be scrutinized or a threat to be neutralized, rarely a condition to be meaningfully addressed. The legacy of Nick's life before confinement complicates any simple narrative. He was not defined solely by his worst moment, nor was he a figure of pure victimhood. He was someone who tried, failed, tried again, and failed differently each time. His struggles with addiction and psychosis were not moral failings, but symptoms of deeper instability. Yet the harm that followed cannot be erased by explanation alone. This tension sits at the heart of his story, forcing uncomfortable reflection. How much responsibility can be assigned when perception itself is fractured? How much protection should the system provide when the consequences are irreversible? These questions have no satisfying answers, only implications that ripple outward. For his family, the legacy is heavy and unresolved. Love, guilt, grief, and regret exist simultaneously, tangled in ways that resist closure. The loss of his parents is permanent, a wound that will never fully heal for those who knew them. At the same time, the loss of the son they once recognized has unfolded more slowly, marked by distance, institutional barriers, and the erosion of his identity. In this sense, the tragedy did not end with death. It continued in the form of a life suspended, neither fully accountable nor fully cared for, existing in limbo between legal judgment and medical assessment. On a wider level, Nick's case leaves behind a troubling reflection on legacy itself. What does society remember? Is it the crime, the diagnosis, the punishment, or the unanswered questions? For many, His name will forever be linked to violence and downfall. For others, it will serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of systems designed to help but ill-equipped to adapt. The justice system often measures success in convictions and sentences, while mental health systems measure it in compliance and symptom reduction. Neither metric captures the complexity of a human life unraveling under pressure. In this gap, people like Nick are lost. The environment that now surrounds him reinforces that loss daily. Surveillance replaces trust. Routine replaces empathy. Over time, these conditions shape not just behavior, but identity. When every movement is observed and documented, spontaneity disappears. When every expression of distress is recorded as a risk factor, vulnerability becomes dangerous. Survival depends on becoming smaller, quieter, easier to manage. This is not rehabilitation. It is erosion. The legacy of such an existence is not transformation, but reduction. It leaves behind a person defined by constraints rather than potential. Yet even within this bleak landscape, the story carries lessons that extend beyond one individual. It challenges the assumption that resources alone can prevent tragedy. It exposes the fragility of systems that rely on rigid categories to manage complex realities. It raises the question of whether punishment and treatment must always be mutually exclusive, or whether new approaches are needed to address cases where illness and harm collide. Nick Reiner's life, now narrowed to a cell and a legal process, stands as a mirror reflecting these unresolved tensions. His legacy may not be one of redemption or resolution, but of confrontation. It forces society to confront how quickly empathy fades when fear takes over, how easily complexity is flattened into labels, and how little room remains for those who do not fit neatly into existing frameworks. In that sense, his story endures not because it offers answers, but because it leaves behind questions that refuse to disappear. The story does not end with a verdict or a sentence, because the reality Nick Reiner lives in now is not defined by resolution. It is defined by waiting. Waiting for court dates, for evaluations, for decisions made in rooms he will never enter. Each day unfolds in the same narrow space, under the same unblinking light, marked by the same footsteps and observations. Time no longer carries momentum. It simply passes, heavy and repetitive, pressing down until the future feels abstract and unreachable. This is the quiet aftermath of a life that collapsed all at once, leaving behind fragments that no longer fit together. What remains is not just a defendant awaiting judgment, but a human being suspended between systems, belonging fully to neither. His days are governed by procedure rather than purpose. Movement is limited. Speech is monitored. Even thought feels constrained by the constant awareness of being watched. In this environment, hope does not arrive in grand gestures. It appears, if at all, in small, almost imperceptible moments. A stretch of uninterrupted sleep. A conversation that lasts a few minutes longer than usual. A brief sense that his mind is not completely at war with itself. These moments are fragile, easily erased by the next interruption, the next reminder of how little control he has over his own life. Outside the walls, the world continues to debate what his fate should be. Legal arguments weigh responsibility against competence. Public opinion oscillates between outrage and pity. Mental health advocates call for reform, while others insist that the severity of the crime demands uncompromising punishment. These discussions unfold at a distance, often abstracted from the daily reality of confinement. They shape policy and perception, but they do not change the cold air in his cell or the light that never turns off. Nick remains where these debates intersect, living proof of their consequences rather than an active participant in them. The absence of closure affects more than just him. For those who follow the case, there is a lingering discomfort that refuses to settle. The story resists a clean ending. It does not offer the satisfaction of a solved mystery or the reassurance of clear moral boundaries. Instead, it leaves behind a sense of unease, a recognition that some tragedies expose fractures too deep to be easily repaired. The loss of life cannot be undone. The suffering that followed cannot be neatly justified or erased. In that space, viewers are left to confront their own assumptions about justice, responsibility, and compassion. Nick's story forces a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. It asks whether systems designed to protect society are also capable of protecting the humanity of those within them. It challenges the idea that isolation and surveillance can substitute for understanding. It raises the possibility that preventing future harm may require more than containment, that it may demand earlier intervention, better communication, and a willingness to listen before crisis turns irreversible. These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that persist long after the headlines fade. As his case moves forward, the outcome will shape his life in irreversible ways. A life sentence would lock him into permanent confinement. A mental health commitment would redefine his existence under a different name, but similar restrictions. Even the rare possibility of improvement does not promise freedom, only a different form of supervision. Each path leads away from the life he once imagined, toward an existence defined by limits and oversight. The choice between them lies largely outside his control, determined by evaluations, rulings, and assessments that reduce a complex life to legal criteria. In this sense, the ending remains open but not hopeful. It is open in the way a long corridor is open, stretching forward without visible doors. What meaning can be drawn from such a story depends on the viewer. Some will see it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated mental illness. Others will see it as evidence of a system that fails those it is meant to help. Many will feel both at once, unsure where responsibility truly lies. That uncertainty is not a weakness of the story. It is its core. It reflects the reality that human lives rarely conform to the clean narratives we prefer. Nick Reiner's story does not ask for forgiveness or condemnation. It asks for attention. It asks viewers to sit with discomfort, to resist the urge for quick judgments, and to consider the human cost that exists beyond legal outcomes. In the end, what remains is a question rather than a conclusion. When a life defined by struggle ends up behind bars, watched endlessly and understood only in fragments, what does justice truly look like? And if the systems meant to protect and punish leave so much suffering in their wake, what responsibility do we share in imagining something better? That question lingers unresolved long after the screen goes dark.